Nobody said her name out loud at first. That's what made it strange. One day, she was everywhere. On every highlight reel. On every sports debate show. On every ticket stub that suddenly mattered. The rookie who didn't just join the league, but dragged it into conversations it had never been part of before. Sold-out arenas. Record-breaking ratings. Crowds showing up early just to watch warm-ups. People who had never watched a WNBA game suddenly arguing about defensive schemes and foul calls like they'd been fans for years. And then she was gone. Not injured. Not suspended. Not traded. Just gone. No announcement. No explanation. No press conference. No team statement. No injury designation. Not even a vague social post saying day-to-day. One game she's there, commanding attention like gravity. The next, her name isn't even mentioned. Like someone flipped a switch and decided the safest move was to pretend she never existed. That's when people started whispering. Because stars don't disappear quietly unless someone wants them to. At first, fans assumed it was temporary. A rest decision. A behind-the-scenes tweak. Something minor that would be explained later. But later never came. And with every hour of silence, the situation got harder to ignore. Comment sections filled with the same question over and over again. Where is Caitlin Clark? The league didn't answer. Teams didn't answer. Media tiptoed around it. And that silence did something dangerous. It invited curiosity. And curiosity, when ignored, turns into investigation. Because this wasn't just any player. This was the player. The one who changed how people talked about women's basketball without asking permission first. The one who made executives uncomfortable by accident. The one who didn't fit neatly into anyone's long-term plan. And when the biggest name in the sport vanishes without a trace, people don't move on. They dig. What fans would eventually uncover wasn't just a benching. It wasn't a rotation change. It wasn't basketball at all. It was a warning. And once you understand how it started, everything that followed makes a lot more sense. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from a headline. It came from practice. Reporters showed up expecting the usual routine. Cameras out. Notes ready. Casual chatter about matchups and minutes. But then something fell off. Caitlin Clark wasn't warming up with the starters. Not stretching where she always stretched. Not laughing with the same group. Not even visible in the usual places. At first, no one panicked. Practices are fluid. Players rotate. Coaches experiment. Then someone checked the rotation board. Her name wasn't there. That's when the mood changed. This wasn't a late scratch. This wasn't a minutes restriction. This wasn't a precaution. The league's most visible rookie wasn't just sitting. She wasn't part of the plan at all. And nobody seemed willing to say why. Questions started immediately. Calm ones at first. Polite ones. The kind that assume there's a reasonable explanation waiting right around the corner. Coaches responded with the same vague language fans had grown used to hearing. We're evaluating things. We're looking at the bigger picture. It's a long season. Nothing concrete. Nothing specific. And that's when the theories started stacking up. Maybe it was load management. Maybe it was discipline. Maybe it was internal conflict. Maybe it was something the public wasn't ready to hear yet. But every theory collapsed the moment people looked at the facts. She wasn't hurt. No limp. No medical updates. No reports from insiders suggesting anything physical was wrong. Her conditioning was elite. Her minutes had already been managed carefully. That excuse didn't survive a basic reality check. Discipline? For what? There were no reports of missed practices. No violations. No off-court incidents. Nothing that even hinted at a rules issue. Players don't get erased without leaks when discipline is involved. Someone always talks. Then there were the numbers. And the numbers told a completely different story than the silence suggested. She was leading or near the top in every category that actually mattered. Points. Assists. Offensive impact. On-court influence that didn't always show up in box scores but exploded on film. When she played, defenses shifted. When she sat, energy dropped. That wasn't opinion. That was visible. Even more telling was what happened outside the lines. Attendance didn't just rise when she played. It surged. Cities that had struggled to fill seats suddenly had sellouts. Merchandise sales followed her name. Broadcast ratings spiked whenever she was scheduled to appear. Social media engagement tripled around her highlights. From a business perspective, benching her made 0 sense. From a competitive perspective, it made even less. which left only one uncomfortable possibility. This wasn't about basketball, and that realization spread fast. Fans started lining up timelines. Not emotionally, logically. When did her minutes start dropping? When did media tone shift? When did official league accounts quietly stop pushing her highlights as aggressively? When did praise turn into polite acknowledgement? The pattern wasn't subtle once people stopped pretending it was coincidence. She didn't fade out. She was removed. And removal requires intent. That's when people remembered something important. Caitlin Clark didn't just play the game differently. She talked about it differently. She answered questions honestly. She didn't soften criticism. She didn't dress up frustration in safe language. She spoke like someone who assumed the sport could handle truth. That's a problem in spaces built on control. Institutions are comfortable with stars until stars become independent, until they develop voices that don't need approval, until they attract attention that can't be redirected on command. And Caitlin's attention couldn't be controlled. She wasn't just driving ratings. She was shaping conversations about officiating, about marketing, about how the game connected with real fans instead of idealized ones. She wasn't loud about it. She didn't stage rebellions. She just didn't play along. And sometimes that's worse. The disappearance didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened after a stretch of subtle tension. A few interviews that felt too honest. A few reactions that weren't polished. A few moments where she sounded more like a leader than a rookie. That makes people nervous. Especially people who believe influence should be earned slowly, carefully, and under supervision. The league never said her name. But by refusing to explain her absence, they said everything. Because silence isn't neutral. Silence is strategy. And once fans realized they weren't being told the truth, the situation crossed a line it could never come back from. The question shifted. It wasn't "where is Caitlin Clark" anymore. It became something much bigger. What happens when the biggest star in the league becomes inconvenient? And more importantly, who decides when a player has too much power? At first, everyone pretended this was a good thing. That's how it always starts. A young player breaks through. Ratings jump. Arenas fill. New fans show up. Executives smile in interviews and talk about growth and momentum like they planned it all along. Caitlin Clark was framed as a success story the league could proudly point to. But behind the scenes, success doesn't always feel like success. Because Caitlin didn't just bring attention. She redirected it. For years, the league had worked carefully to control how women's basketball was presented, which stories were told, which players were elevated, which narratives felt safe. Growth was welcome, but only if it followed the approved path. Incremental, predictable, manageable. Caitlin blew straight through that. She didn't wait for permission to become the face of the sport. Fans chose her. Media followed the numbers. Broadcasters adjusted coverage in real time because ignoring her was bad business. Suddenly, one player was driving conversation without asking the league how she should be framed. That kind of influence is intoxicating on the surface and terrifying underneath, because when attention concentrates around one person, control slips. Messaging gets messy. Old hierarchies get questioned. Long-standing power dynamics start to wobble. And the people at the top begin to realize something uncomfortable. They aren't steering this anymore. Caitlin's presence changed how games were consumed. Fans didn't just watch her team. They watched for her. Road games felt like home games. Opposing arenas filled with Clark jerseys. Warm-ups became events. Pre-game tunnels turned into content gold. That wasn't normal rookie behavior. That was superstar behavior. And superstars come with leverage, even when they don't ask for it. Every interview she gave pulled attention away from carefully curated talking points. She spoke about the game the way fans talked about it online. Direct, honest, sometimes critical, always confident. She didn't attack the league, but she didn't protect it either. And that middle ground made people uneasy. Because she wasn't just playing well. She was shaping opinion. She made fans question officiating patterns. She made people talk about physical play that went unchecked. She made conversations about marketing feel outdated. She made it obvious that the audience wasn't as small or passive as it had been treated for years. That's when whispers started circulating. Not publicly, privately. Concerns about balance, about overshadowing, about protecting the league as a whole. Those phrases sound harmless, responsible even, but they're often code for fear. Fear that one voice might become louder than the institution itself. Fear that one player could expose gaps leadership preferred to keep invisible. Fear that if fans connected more to athletes than to the league brand, control would shift permanently. And Caitlin was accelerating that shift without even trying. She didn't organize protests. She didn't call out executives by name. She didn't demand change publicly. She just existed loudly in a space that had grown comfortable with quiet compliance. Her popularity wasn't something the league created. That's the key part. It happened organically, through highlights, through performances, through moments that felt real instead of packaged. Fans didn't need to be told why she mattered. They felt it. That kind of connection bypasses traditional power structures. And once that happens, institutions face a choice: adapt or contain. For a while, it looked like adaptation was possible. Caitlin was featured prominently, promoted heavily, used as proof that the league was evolving. But that phase didn't last long, because promotion is easy when the star stays predictable. Independence changes the equation. As her platform grew, so did scrutiny. Every word she said was dissected, every reaction analyzed. Not just by fans, but internally. People started paying attention to what she didn't say as much as what she did, to when she spoke without checking the temperature of the room. And that's when the narrative subtly shifted. Praise became qualified. Compliments came with caveats. Discussions about her impact started including phrases like learning curve and adjustment period, even when her performance didn't support that framing. It was a soft recalibration, a way to gently pull attention back toward equilibrium. But it didn't work, because you can't downplay someone fans are actively watching. And the more the league tried to smooth her edges, the sharper everything felt. Her interviews didn't get louder. They got more pointed, not aggressive, just clear. She spoke like someone who understood her value and didn't feel the need to shrink it for comfort. That confidence is celebrated in men's sports. In women's sports, it often triggers resistance. The unspoken rule has always been gratitude first, ambition second. Caitlin flipped that order without announcing it. She played like someone who expected the league to meet her level, not the other way around. That expectation alone can feel threatening. Because once a player realizes she doesn't need validation from the system loses leverage. And Caitlin was dangerously close to that realization. Her popularity had outgrown its usefulness as a controlled asset. It had become an uncontrollable force. One that could shift power toward players, toward fans, toward conversations leadership wasn't ready to have. That's when influence turns into a problem. Not because it's harmful, but because it's free. And free influence is the one thing institutions struggle to manage. So when her minutes started shrinking, it didn't feel random to the people paying attention. It felt like a message. A quiet reminder that no matter how big you get, the system still decides when you're visible. Or at least, that's what they thought. Because the attempt to contain her didn't make her smaller. It made everyone else start asking questions. And once those questions started spreading, the situation was already past the point of control. Up next, it gets even more uncomfortable. Because the tension wasn't just abstract. It wasn't just about power or influence. It was personal. And it was happening behind closed doors. Publicly, everything looked calm. That was the illusion. Behind the scenes, the temperature was rising fast. It didn't start with shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Those almost never happen at first. It started with discomfort, awkward pauses, conversations that ended too quickly, meetings where Caitlin spoke and the room didn't respond the way it used to. At some point, people inside the organization began to realize something had shifted. Caitlin wasn't just listening anymore. She was questioning. According to multiple accounts from people close to the situation, the tension built slowly, over time, through moments that seemed insignificant on their own. A post-game interview that didn't echo the approved narrative. A comment about fan experience that sounded more like criticism than praise. A suggestion about how the league could market games that landed the wrong way. None of it was explosive. That's what made it dangerous. Because it suggested confidence. She wasn't acting like a rookie grateful to be there. She was acting like someone who believed her perspective mattered. Like someone who understood her presence was driving momentum and felt a responsibility to speak honestly about it. That kind of mindset challenges hierarchy without ever naming it. And hierarchies don't respond well to that. Insiders have since claimed that Caitlin raised concerns privately before anything became public. about scheduling decisions that hurt fan engagement, about promotional strategies that felt disconnected from what audiences actually wanted, about how certain storylines were pushed while others were ignored. To her, these weren't attacks. They were observations. But to leadership, they sounded like challenges. Because the unspoken rule was simple. Players play. Executives decide. Feedback flows in one direction, and only when requested. Caitlin didn't storm into meetings demanding change. She didn't threaten. She didn't posture. She just didn't stay quiet. And that alone set her apart. One particularly explosive rumor that circulated later suggested Caitlin directly questioned marketing priorities during a closed-door discussion. Not emotionally. Not disrespectfully. Just plainly. She allegedly pointed out that fans were responding to authenticity, not manufactured narratives. That trying to force balance was diluting momentum instead of spreading it. That comment reportedly didn't land well. Not because it was wrong, but because it exposed a gap between leadership strategy and reality. Less than 2 days after that meeting, her minutes dipped. Within 72 hours, she was barely part of the rotation. Then came the silence. No explanation. No acknowledgement. No clarification. Just a sudden, unmistakable shift. To people watching closely, the timeline was impossible to ignore. Feedback. Friction. Reduced visibility. Removal. That sequence doesn't happen by accident. What made it worse was how the situation was handled afterward. Instead of addressing concerns or clarifying intent, communication shut down completely. Caitlin wasn't given space to explain her perspective publicly. She wasn't defended. She wasn't even referenced. It was as if the strategy was to let time erase the problem. But erasing a person only works when no one is looking. And everyone was looking. Inside the locker room, players noticed immediately. Not just the benching, but the atmosphere. Conversations changed. People stopped speaking freely. Eyes darted around during meetings. You could feel the calculation happening in real time. What's safe to say? What isn't? Caitlin's situation became a lesson without being labeled as one. This is what happens when you push back. Not aggressively. Not loudly. Just enough to make people uncomfortable. And that message landed. Teammates didn't need an official explanation. They understood the implication. If someone with Caitlin's visibility could be sidelined without warning, anyone could. That realization doesn't inspire loyalty. It breeds fear. And fear has consequences. The strangest part was that Caitlin herself didn't lash out. She didn't post cryptic messages. She didn't hint at conspiracies. She didn't rally fans. She stayed quiet, professional, composed, which only fueled speculation further. Because silence from someone known for honesty feels louder than outrage. Fans started replaying her old interviews, searching for clues. Moments that once felt harmless suddenly felt loaded. Comments about officiating, about physical play, about respect for players. In hindsight, they sounded less like observations and more like warnings. The league, meanwhile, doubled down on vagueness. Every non-answer confirmed suspicion. Because when institutions have nothing to hide, they explain. When they do, they deflect. And this felt like deflection layered on top of avoidance, layered on top of denial. What really escalated things was the realization that Caitlin wasn't the only one affected. Reports began circulating that other players had been quietly discouraged from speaking up in the past. Stories from former athletes resurfaced. Accounts of careers stalling after asking the wrong questions. Of opportunities drying up without explanation. Suddenly, Caitlin's situation didn't feel isolated. It felt familiar. And that's when it crossed from controversy into pattern. Patterns are dangerous. They can't be dismissed as misunderstandings. They demand accountability. They suggest systems, not mistakes. Inside the league, leadership likely believed the storm would pass. That fans would move on. That another storyline would take over. That attention would drift somewhere safer. But something unexpected happened. Instead of fading, the silence amplified everything. Because fans didn't just want Caitlin back on the court. They wanted the truth. And once people start demanding truth, control becomes optional. That's when the first player decided she wasn't going to wait anymore. Someone who understood the risk. Someone who knew exactly what speaking up could cost. Someone who looked at Caitlin's situation and decided silence was worse. Her name was Sophie Cunningham. And what she said next changed everything. At first, the league tried to shrink the moment. That was the strategy. No dramatic statements. No emotional reactions. Just controlled language delivered calmly, as if repeating it enough times would make people accept it. Rotation decisions. Long-term development. Trust the process. Phrases that sound responsible on paper but mean nothing when the situation doesn't match reality. The idea was simple. If you don't give controversy oxygen, it suffocates. But that only works when the audience isn't paying attention. And this time, they were watching everything. Fans didn't react emotionally right away. They analyzed. They compared. They pulled stats, minutes, game film, rotations from past seasons. They looked at how other stars were treated under similar circumstances. They checked how rookies with far less impact were handled. They tracked patterns. What they found made the official explanation impossible to defend. Caitlin Clark wasn't struggling. She wasn't inconsistent. She wasn't a liability on either end of the floor. Her numbers didn't justify reduced minutes, let alone complete removal. Even advanced metrics showed her influence was undeniable. Lineups performed better with her on the floor. Offensive flow improved. Defensive attention shifted. This wasn't subjective. It was measurable. So the league's talking points didn't just feel hollow. They felt insulting. Because rotational decisions don't erase your most impactful player without warning. Coaches don't suddenly decide a player selling out arenas no longer fits the plan. Not without explanation. Not without preparation. Not without backlash. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Media outlets tried to play it safe at first. Headlines danced around the issue. Analysts chose neutral language. Everyone waited for clarity that never came. That hesitation only widened the gap between what fans were seeing and what they were being told. Silence stretched on. Every hour without answers felt deliberate. Every non-response felt like confirmation. And then Sophie Cunningham spoke. She didn't ease into it. She didn't ask permission. She didn't soften the message. She walked straight into the space athletes are quietly warned to avoid and said what everyone else was thinking out loud. You don't sideline your biggest star unless you're scared of her power. That sentence didn't just cut through the noise. It blew it apart. Because Sophie wasn't a fan speculating online. She wasn't a commentator chasing clicks. She was a player. Someone inside the system. Someone who understood exactly what she was risking by saying that publicly. Her words reframed the entire situation instantly. This wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about fear. Fear of influence. Fear of independence. Fear of losing control over a narrative that had been carefully curated for years. The reaction was immediate. Clips spread across social media in minutes. Not hours. Minutes. Fans didn't just agree. They recognized truth when they heard it. Sports media couldn't ignore it anymore. Once a player crosses that line publicly, the story becomes unavoidable. Because athletes are trained not to do that. They're trained to protect the brand. And Sophie didn't. She doubled down. In follow-up conversations, she made it clear she wasn't talking about basketball decisions. She was talking about politics. About control. About what happens when a player becomes bigger than the structure meant to contain them. She said what the league refused to say. Caitlin wasn't benched because she underperformed. She was sidelined because she couldn't be managed. That distinction changed everything. Now the league wasn't just facing fans. It was facing its own players. And that's a much more dangerous audience. Because players understand subtext. They've seen careers stall quietly. They've watched opportunities disappear without explanation. They know how power moves when it doesn't want to be questioned. Sophie's statement didn't come off as reckless. It came off as fed up. And that resonated. Suddenly, silence wasn't neutral anymore. It felt complicit. Players who stayed quiet weren't just being professional. They were being measured against someone who had just put everything on the line. The league tried to regain control. Behind the scenes, conversations intensified. PR teams scrambled. Messaging was refined. The goal shifted from ignoring the controversy to minimizing it. But the damage was already done. Because Sophie had done something irreversible. She named the fear. Once fear is exposed, authority weakens. And the league's response made things worse. Instead of addressing the claim head-on, leadership leaned harder into generic explanations. Statements avoided names, avoided timelines, avoided accountability. They framed everything as routine, hoping repetition would dull outrage. It didn't. It sharpened it. Fans saw through the language immediately. Reporters started asking harder questions. Analysts stopped pretending the situation was normal. Former players chimed in, saying rotational decisions don't look like this. Not ever. Even people who had no emotional attachment to Caitlin Clark could see the logic break down. And Sophie wasn't done. By continuing to speak, she forced others to confront their own silence. Every interview she gave raised the stakes. She didn't just criticize a decision. She challenged a culture. One that punishes players the moment excellence comes with a voice. She knew the risks. Endorsements could vanish. Minutes could drop. Doors could quietly close. Opportunities could dry up without explanation. The system has ways of reminding people who's in charge. And she spoke anyway. That choice mattered, because it gave permission. Permission for others to stop pretending everything was fine. Permission to ask uncomfortable questions. Permission to stop protecting a narrative that no longer matched reality. And once that permission existed, it didn't belong to Sophie anymore. It spread. The league believed the story could be contained by refusing to engage. Sophie proved that silence only works until someone refuses to participate in it. And just when leadership thought they were dealing with one outspoken player, another voice stepped forward. This one didn't hedge. This one didn't pause. This one made it impossible to pretend this was isolated. Her name was Lexi Hall. And what she said next turned discomfort into full-blown crisis. Sophie's words cracked the surface. Lexi Hall shattered it. She didn't tease a message. She didn't hint. She didn't wait for the moment to cool off. The very next day, after practice, Lexi walked straight into the press room and did the one thing athletes are quietly trained not to do. She spoke from the chest. No script. No polished phrasing. No buffer language to protect anyone's feelings. If this can happen to Caitlin Clark, she said, what do you think they'll do to the rest of us? That was it. One sentence. And the room froze. Because that question wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't dramatic. It was logical. And logic is dangerous when it exposes power. Lexi didn't accuse anyone directly. She didn't name executives. She didn't outline conspiracies. She simply pointed out the obvious truth everyone had been avoiding. If the league could erase its biggest star without explanation, no one was safe. That statement traveled faster than Sophie's. Not because it was louder, because it was universal. It wasn't just about Caitlin anymore. It was about every player watching from the sidelines, every rookie wondering how much honesty was allowed, every veteran who had survived by staying quiet. Lexi turned a single situation into a system-wide question. And once that happened, the league lost the ability to frame this as a one-off. The clip exploded across platforms. ESPN panels replayed it. Podcasts dissected it. Independent creators ran it back with captions like, "This is the real issue." Fans didn't argue over interpretation. They understood exactly what she meant. Because fear doesn't need translation. What made Lexi's moment even more powerful was what came next. Later that day, she posted a black-and-white photo of herself standing beside Caitlin Clark. No long caption. No explanation. Just one word. Loyalty. That single word did more damage than 1,000 tweets ever could. People stared at it, trying to decode intent. Was it aimed at management? At teammates who stayed silent? At a league that expected obedience over honesty? Lexi didn't clarify. She didn't need to. The timing said everything. The post spread instantly. Screenshots flooded timelines. Comment sections lit up. Fans read it as a line in the sand. A declaration that Caitlin wasn't alone, no matter how hard the league tried to isolate her. Then something strange happened. The post vanished. Deleted. And that deletion poured gasoline on an already raging fire. Because people don't delete posts when everything is fine. They delete them when pressure arrives. Fans had already grabbed screenshots. Those images spread faster than the original ever did. Reddit threads popped up within minutes. TikTok creators stitched the post with breakdowns of what it meant. Twitter timelines replayed it alongside Sophie's comments, framing the moment as coordinated resistance. Lexi's silence after deleting the post didn't calm anything. It escalated it. Soon after, another message surfaced. Brief, blunt, and gone almost as quickly as it appeared. If you want to build a legacy, stop silencing the ones who created it. That was the line. And once again, it disappeared. But screenshots don't. By this point, nobody believed in coincidence anymore. Fans didn't ask whether Lexi was reacting intentionally. They asked who was trying to make her stop. Reports began circulating that Lexi had become one of the most vocal players in internal meetings following Caitlin's disappearance. According to leaked accounts, she challenged staff directly, asked why the player selling out arenas was suddenly invisible, questioned how decisions were being justified when performance said otherwise. Those questions reportedly weren't welcomed. But Lexi didn't back down. Instead of retreating, she leaned in. She became a bridge between players who felt uneasy and players who were angry but afraid to speak. Younger athletes, especially, began paying attention, watching closely, measuring risk against integrity. Lexi wasn't reckless. She was calculated, and that's what made her dangerous to the status quo. She understood exactly what she was doing. She knew every word would be analyzed. She knew every post would be scrutinized. She knew silence would be easier. She chose not to take it. Together, Sophie and Lexi had crossed a threshold the league wasn't prepared for. One outspoken player can be dismissed as emotional. Two start to look like a pattern, and patterns demand answers. What had once been framed as a rotational decision now looked like something else entirely. Something structural, something intentional, something rooted in fear of losing control over voices that refused to shrink. The league was no longer dealing with fan outrage alone. It was dealing with internal solidarity. And solidarity is the one thing silence can't suppress. Players across teams began communicating privately. Not publicly. Not on record. Quiet conversations. Text chains. Calls that didn't leave a paper trail. Athletes comparing experiences. Noticing similarities. Connecting dots they'd been trained to ignore. Lexi and Sophie didn't organize this. They ignited it. And once that fire started spreading, there was no PR strategy powerful enough to put it out. The league had underestimated one thing. Fans will fight for stars, but players will fight for each other. And when those two forces align, control starts slipping fast. Up next, everything explodes. Because fans didn't just react emotionally. They investigated. And what they uncovered pushed this story far beyond basketball. At first, it looked like chaos. Hashtags everywhere. Clips flying across timelines. Comment sections overflowing with anger. To outsiders, it felt like another social media storm that would burn hot and then disappear. But this wasn't random. It was methodical. Fans didn't just complain. They started documenting. Someone posted a timeline showing exactly when Caitlin Clark's minutes dipped. Another lined it up with her interviews. Someone else tracked official league social accounts and noticed a sudden drop in her visibility. Fewer highlights. Fewer mentions. Less amplification. At first, it seemed subtle. Then it became undeniable. People began pulling game footage. Not just highlights, but full possessions. They clipped moments where Caitlin absorbed heavy contact with no whistle. Compared them to similar plays involving other stars that resulted in immediate calls. Freeze frames circulated. Slow-motion breakdowns followed. This wasn't emotional analysis. It was forensic. Reddit threads turned into full-scale investigations. Users organized posts by category. Minutes. Fouls. Rotations. Media coverage. Marketing decisions. Every inconsistency was logged. Every unanswered question documented. TikTok creators broke it down frame by frame, explaining things in simple language that spread fast. Instagram comment sections on official WNBA posts stopped talking about the content entirely and became protest walls demanding answers. What happened to Caitlin? Why won't you explain? Stop silencing players. The same messages appeared everywhere. Not because they were coordinated at first, but because everyone arrived at the same conclusion. This wasn't accidental. Fans noticed something else too. Whenever Caitlin wasn't expected to play, ticket resale activity spiked. Seats that had been impossible to find suddenly flooded the market. Prices dropped. Demand collapsed. People screenshotted that too. Cities that had felt the rush of sold-out arenas watched it disappear overnight. The contrast was brutal. 1 week, lines around the building. The next, empty sections and quiet entrances. Numbers don't lie. And fans made sure everyone saw them. The movement gained momentum fast. Hashtags evolved from questions into accusations. From curiosity into demands. Justice for Clark. Free Caitlin. Stop silencing stars. Each one climbing higher, feeding the next wave of attention. Even people who weren't Caitlin fans started paying attention. Because the pattern was bigger than one player. It was about control. Mainstream sports media couldn't ignore it anymore. When fan-led investigations start outperforming official explanations, the narrative shifts. Analysts who had stayed neutral suddenly began acknowledging the inconsistencies. Phrases like "this doesn't add up" started creeping into broadcasts. Former players added fuel to the fire. Some spoke cautiously. Others didn't. They shared stories of their own careers. Moments where speaking honestly led to fewer minutes. Where asking questions stalled momentum. Where silence was rewarded and authenticity punished. Those stories hit differently, because they matched what fans were seeing in real time. The internet-connected dots leadership hoped would stay separate. And then the pressure reached the place that always forces a reaction. Money. Reports began circulating that sponsors were asking questions privately, not issuing statements, not making threats publicly, just asking for clarity before continuing partnerships. That kind of inquiry terrifies organizations, because it doesn't come with hashtags. It comes with consequences. Fans didn't stop there. They started tagging sponsors directly, politely at first, then persistently, asking whether they supported silencing players, whether they were comfortable aligning with an organization refusing transparency. Those posts gained traction fast. Brands noticed. You could feel the tone shift. This wasn't just about basketball discourse anymore. It became a cultural conversation about how institutions treat the people who generate their value, about whether leagues serve players or control them, about who really owns a sport, the executives or the athletes fans actually show up for. And through all of it, the league stayed quiet. That silence didn't calm the storm. It validated it. Because when fans do your investigation for you and you still refuse to respond, people assume the truth is worse than anything being said. By the time the story crossed fully into mainstream coverage, it had already evolved beyond damage control. This wasn't something a single press release could fix. Too many eyes, too much documentation, too much momentum. The league had lost control of its own narrative. And once that happens, every response becomes reactive instead of authoritative. Fans weren't guessing anymore. They were concluding, which left leadership with only one option. Say something. Anything. And when they finally did, it proved the fans right. When the league finally broke its silence, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like confirmation. After days of mounting pressure, non-stop fan investigation, player commentary spiraling beyond control, and sponsors quietly circling, the WNBA released an official statement. No dramatic timing. No live press conference. Just a carefully worded block of text dropped into the feed like it was supposed to calm everything down. It didn't, because the statement did one thing above all else. It avoided Caitlin Clark's name entirely. No direct reference. No acknowledgement of the controversy. No explanation for her disappearance. Instead, the league leaned on familiar language. Strategic rotational decisions. Long-term development. Trust in coaching evaluations. Phrases designed to sound professional while saying absolutely nothing. Fans read it once, then twice, then started tearing it apart line by line. Because when you've spent days watching evidence stack up, vague language doesn't reassure you. It insults you. It suggests leadership either doesn't understand the problem or refuses to acknowledge it. Reporters immediately noticed what was missing. No timeline, no clarity, no accountability, not even a basic recognition that fans had legitimate questions. The statement wasn't meant to explain. It was meant to close the conversation. And that was the mistake, because the conversation was already too big. Reaction was instant and brutal. Social media flooded with screenshots of the statement highlighted and annotated. Fans pointed out contradictions. Analysts called it evasive. Even neutral commentators admitted it felt detached from reality. The phrase damage control started trending alongside Caitlin's name. Then the players responded, not with long rebuttals, with precision. Sophie Cunningham reacted with a single eye-roll emoji. No caption, no clarification, just that. And it landed harder than any paragraph ever could. Within minutes, it pulled tens of thousands of likes. Fans understood exactly what it meant. A silent translation that said, "We see what you're doing." Lexi Hall followed shortly after. She reposted a clip of the statement being read on air and added one line beneath it. "So we're pretending this is normal now." That was it. Sarcasm stripped the statement of any remaining authority. Fans boosted both reactions until they completely drowned out the league's original message. Search results began showing player reactions above the statement itself. That's when leadership lost control completely. Because when players openly mock official communication, it signals something powerful. Respect is gone. Fear is fading. And the hierarchy that once kept everything in line no longer works. Even veteran analysts who usually stay cautious couldn't ignore it. Former players tweeted that rotational decisions don't erase MVP-level impact without explanation. Others said the statement raised more questions than it answered. Engagement numbers told the same story. Official league posts saw interaction fall off a cliff. Meanwhile, content criticizing leadership exploded. Independent creators pulled millions of views breaking down the statement's language and explaining why it failed. The league had tried to sound calm. But calm doesn't work when trust is gone. Inside locker rooms, the reaction was even more damaging. Players didn't need public statements to interpret what happened. They understood the message clearly. Leadership chose deflection over dialogue, control over clarity, optics over honesty. That realization spread quietly but quickly. Veterans who had survived for years under the system began clashing with younger players who no longer saw silence as protection. Conversations grew tense. Trust frayed. Teams felt divided in ways that had nothing to do with basketball. Silence versus resistance. Compliance versus courage. According to sources close to multiple teams, the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. Players stopped speaking freely in group settings. Whispers replaced laughter. Eye contact felt loaded. Everyone was calculating risk. The league hadn't just failed to calm fans. It fractured its own workforce. And then something unexpected happened. Former players started speaking up. Athletes who had left the league years earlier began sharing eerily similar stories. Accounts of being sidelined after questioning decisions. Of opportunities vanishing quietly. Of careers stalling with no explanation ever given. Each story added weight. Because it showed Caitlyn's situation wasn't new. It was just visible. For the first time, the spotlight was too bright to avoid. The internet connected stories across decades. Patterns emerged. The league's history began to look less like isolated incidents and more like a culture problem. And culture problems don't disappear with press releases. They metastasize. Behind closed doors, leadership now faced a choice they never expected to make publicly. Acknowledge the issue and risk losing control. Or double down on silence and risk losing the players themselves. The statement was supposed to end the story. Instead, it proved something critical. The league didn't misunderstand the outrage. It rejected it. And once people realized that, the conversation shifted again. This wasn't about Caitlin Clark's minutes anymore. It was about whether the league could survive a generation of players who refused to stay quiet. And that's when things moved beyond social media. Because inside locker rooms across the league, something deeper was forming. Quietly, deliberately, and dangerously for anyone who thought this would blow over. By the time the statement failed, the damage was already done. It just hadn't surfaced yet. From the outside, games continued. Practices ran. Media obligations were met. Everything looked functional. But inside locker rooms across the league, the atmosphere had changed in ways no press release could fix. Trust was gone. Not between teammates, between players and the system. According to people close to multiple teams, the conversations that followed weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. They were quiet, calculated, private. Players speaking in low voices after practice. Texts sent late at night. Calls made off the record. Everyone was asking the same question. If this can happen to her, what happens to me? Veterans felt it first. They had lived through enough seasons to recognize the signs. The sudden distance from leadership. The way explanations stopped flowing. The way decisions were framed as basketball reasons when everyone knew they weren't. They had survived by adapting, by staying quiet, by choosing longevity over confrontation. But this time felt different, because the player at the center of it wasn't fringe. She wasn't replaceable. She wasn't struggling to stay relevant. Caitlin Clark was driving the league's momentum in real time, and she still got erased. That shook people. Younger players reacted differently. They weren't shaped by the same survival instincts. They grew up in an era where platforms are personal and voices matter, where silence feels like surrender, not strategy. To them, what happened to Caitlin wasn't a warning to fall in line. It was proof the line was broken. That generational divide split locker rooms in subtle ways. Not shouting matches. Tension. Hesitation. Moments where someone would start to speak, then stop. Where players watched each other carefully, trying to figure out who felt safe. Silence stopped being neutral. It started feeling political. Sources later described team meetings that felt colder than usual. Leadership talked. Players listened. But the energy was different. Less buy-in. More skepticism. Fewer nods. More crossed arms. People weren't just hearing words. They were measuring intent. In some locker rooms, players began comparing notes. Stories surfaced quietly. Someone mentioning how their minutes dropped after questioning a decision. Another recalling how speaking honestly to media led to fewer opportunities. A third sharing how a teammate was quietly pushed aside after gaining too much attention. These weren't new stories. They just hadn't been shared openly before. Caitlin's situation gave them context. And context makes patterns impossible to ignore. The most dangerous shift wasn't anger. It was clarity. Players stopped wondering whether they were imagining things. They stopped second-guessing their instincts. When Sophie and Lexi spoke up and nothing immediately happened to them, it cracked the myth that silence was the only protection. That moment mattered more than any tweet. Because it showed resistance didn't automatically equal destruction. Not yet, at least. And once players realized that, conversations escalated. Private group chats formed. Not league-wide. Not official. Small clusters of trust. Athletes from different teams sharing experiences, comparing timelines, asking the same uncomfortable questions. How much are we allowed to say? What happens if we stop playing along? Who actually has our backs? These weren't rebellion meetings. They were reality checks. Meanwhile, leadership sensed something was off, but couldn't quite identify it. On the surface, compliance remained. No mass walkouts. No formal protests. No coordinated statements. But cooperation is different from loyalty. And loyalty was gone. Players still showed up. But belief didn't. That's a dangerous place for any organization to live. Because belief can't be forced. It has to be earned. What made this moment so volatile was that it wasn't driven by one loud incident. It was driven by accumulation. Years of quiet compromises. Careers shaped by unspoken rules. Opportunities withheld without explanation. Caitlin Clark's disappearance didn't create the fracture. It exposed it. And once exposed, fractures don't heal quietly. They widen. Leadership faced an invisible problem. No single demand to negotiate. No official union action. No clear spokesperson to address. Just a growing sense that players no longer trusted the system to act in good faith. That kind of erosion doesn't announce itself. It just waits. Waits until the next flashpoint. And everyone knew another one was coming. Because Sophie and Lexi weren't finished. They hadn't gone quiet. They hadn't backed off. They were watching. And when they reappeared together, it wasn't with tweets. It was with something far more dangerous. A microphone. And nothing prepared. When Sophie Cunningham and Lexi Hall appeared together, people knew something was different immediately. No cryptic posts. No emojis. No half-statements meant to test the waters. They sat side by side in a live interview broadcast across major sports platforms, and for the first time since this all began, nobody tried to soften what was happening. No prepared statements were visible. No carefully paced language. No corporate-approved talking points meant to protect relationships. Just two players who had clearly decided they were done playing defense for a system that wouldn't defend them. The room felt heavy before either of them spoke. Reporters didn't rush in with questions. Cameras rolled quietly. Everyone sensed they were about to hear something that couldn't be walked back. Sophie spoke first. Her voice was calm, steady, almost surgical. "If this is how you treat the player who brought this much attention to the league," she said, "then nobody is safe." No raised voice. No dramatics. That's what made it hit. Because she wasn't reacting anymore. She was diagnosing. That sentence reframed everything yet again. It wasn't about Caitlin Clark's benching. It wasn't about minutes or rotations or PR failures. It was about precedent. About what happens when a system punishes influence instead of embracing it. The room went silent. Reporters froze mid-note. Pens stopped moving. Nobody jumped in to interrupt because there was nothing to interrupt. The truth had landed too cleanly. Sophie continued, making it clear she wasn't attacking a single decision. She was calling out a culture. One that claims to support players while quietly punishing those who challenge comfort zones. One that celebrates growth until growth stops being controllable. Then Lexi leaned forward. She didn't look at Sophie. She looked straight into the camera. "We've been told to stay quiet for too long," she said. "Not anymore. That was it. No elaboration. No explanation. A line in the sand. That moment spread faster than anything that had come before it. Clips flooded timelines within minutes. Not just among WNBA fans, but across the entire sports world. NBA players reposted it almost immediately. Fire emojis. Simple captions. Silent endorsement. That support mattered. Because it told players watching at home they weren't isolated. Rival WNBA stars who had avoided the controversy before began liking the clips. Reposting them. Some added short captions. Finally, say it louder. This matters. Those small gestures carried enormous weight. They signaled alignment. The authenticity was undeniable. This wasn't manufactured outrage. This wasn't branding. These were two athletes who had clearly reached a breaking point and decided the risk of speaking was smaller than the cost of staying silent. Commentators called it the most honest moment in recent league history. Analysts admitted it felt different from anything they'd seen before. Not a protest. Not a boycott. A reckoning. Because once players stop asking for permission to tell the truth, authority changes shape. The league now faced a reality it had never prepared for. This wasn't a PR problem. It was a legitimacy problem. Fans didn't just watch the interview. They believed it. And belief is contagious. Within hours, coordinated fan campaigns escalated. Not chaotic. Targeted. Sponsors were contacted directly. Not with insults, but with questions. Asking where they stood. Asking whether they supported transparency or silence. Independent outlets run by former athletes began publishing deeper investigations. Long-form pieces detailing years of quiet punishments. Careers that stalled without explanation. Patterns that suddenly looked impossible to deny. Everything leadership hoped would stay buried resurfaced at once. Sophie and Lexi had become more than players speaking out. They had become symbols. Proof that the cost of honesty wasn't always immediate destruction. Proof that solidarity could exist without formal organization. Proof that the league's old playbook no longer worked in an era where fans, players, and platforms moved faster than control. Behind closed doors, executives now faced an impossible choice. Acknowledge the culture Sophie and Lexi described and commit to real change. Or double down on silence and watch authority erode as more players realized they had nothing left to lose. The warning had been delivered publicly. Players were done asking politely. Done pretending silence was professionalism. Done protecting a system that wouldn't protect them back. If the league wouldn't defend its athletes, the athletes would defend each other. And once that understanding set in, there was no undoing it. Because the league believed silence could bury truth. They believed removing a star would go unnoticed. They believed control would always overpower outrage. They were wrong. And now, everyone was watching. By the time the noise finally settled, one thing was undeniable. This was never just about Caitlin Clark. She was the spark. But the fire had been building long before she ever stepped on the court. What her disappearance did was expose a truth the league had spent years avoiding. That growth controlled from the top only works until the people generating it realize their value. Caitlin didn't demand power. She didn't organize resistance. She didn't threaten anyone's position. She simply existed honestly in a system built on careful silence. And that was enough to break it. Sophie Cunningham and Lexi Hall didn't create rebellion either. They didn't plan a movement. They reacted the way competitors do when something feels wrong. When logic collapses. When explanations stop matching reality. They said what the system wasn't prepared to hear. That fear, not performance, was driving decisions. And once that idea entered the public conversation, it couldn't be removed. Because fans recognized it instantly. They'd seen it before. In other leagues. In other industries. Anywhere institutions prioritize control over connection. Anywhere authenticity threatens hierarchy. Anywhere voices get loud faster than leadership can manage. What made this moment different was timing. The WNBA wasn't dealing with a disengaged audience anymore. It was dealing with fans who showed up, who paid attention, who documented everything, who didn't need permission to investigate. And it wasn't dealing with players who saw silence as survival. It was dealing with athletes who understood platforms, leverage, and solidarity. That combination is explosive. The league believed it could wait this out. That controversy would fade. That another headline would replace it. That time would do what explanation couldn't. But time doesn't erase patterns. It reveals them. And the pattern that emerged was uncomfortable. A system that celebrates stars until they gain too much influence. That promotes growth until growth stops being predictable. That welcomes attention as long as it stays obedient. Caitlin Clark didn't break rules. She broke expectations. She showed what happens when fans choose a player instead of a narrative. When authenticity beats branding. When one voice resonates louder than years of controlled messaging. And once that happens, the old rules stop working. The real question now isn't whether the league made a mistake. It's whether it understands what just happened. Because moments like this don't end cleanly. They echo. They shape decisions players make next season. They influence what rookies are willing to accept. They determine whether silence remains the default or honesty becomes normal. The league is at a crossroads. It can adapt, or it can double down. It can listen, or it can continue managing optics while trust erodes underneath. Fans are watching. Sponsors are watching. Players are watching. And once people stop believing in the system, rebuilding that belief takes more than statements. It takes action, transparency, accountability. This wasn't the end of a controversy. It was the beginning of a shift. And whether the league acknowledges that shift or resists it will define what women's basketball looks like for years to come. Because the era of quiet compliance just ended. And the next chapter won't be written behind closed doors. And if you want to stay ahead of stories like this, the ones leagues don't want explained, the moments that change sports before headlines catch up, make sure you subscribe right now. Because this story isn't finished. What happens next could reshape the league, redefine player power, and expose even more behind-the-scenes decisions that fans were never meant to see. And when it does, you'll want to be here before everyone else catches on.